We know now that Sumerian literature consists primarily of epics, myths, hymns, laments, and so-called wisdom literature, which consists of proverbs, fables, and essays of various sorts.
Sumerian tablets are probably one of the oldest form of a written record that we have.
What we're looking at here is a Sumerian tablet that actually shows the Tree of Life, flanked by divine beings. You can see here the Anunnaki on each side.
In 1988, the world's foremost expert on ancient Sumer sat alone in a university basement in Philadelphia. He was 91 years old, weeks from death. His spotted hands were trembling over a clay tablet older than the Bible, a tablet he had first translated 40 years earlier, a tablet the entire academic world had already accepted, published, and moved on from. But Samuel Noah Kramer hadn't moved on. Something about his own translation had been eating at him for 4 decades. And now, staring at the clay under fluorescent lights, he finally saw what he'd gotten wrong. Not a word, not a passage, the entire framework. Everything we think we know about humanity's first civilization, the one that invented writing, mathematics, law, and agriculture, was built on his translations, and every single one of them was catastrophically wrong. His colleagues would try to bury what he said next. But before he died, the truth had to come out. The tablet that broke him. For half a century, Kramer's word was the final word on the oldest civilization in human history. Nobody questioned him. Nobody had the credentials to. He translated more ancient Sumerian tablets than any person who ever lived. His work wasn't just respected, it was gospel. Then he found something that shattered everything. The tablet came from Nippur, one of the oldest cities ever built, dated to around 2100 BCE. It had been sitting in the University of Pennsylvania Museum for decades, already translated, already published, already forgotten. Kramer himself had handled it back in 1949. The text looked straightforward, a dialogue between a human and a god. The god explains how the divine beings granted civilization to humanity. A gift, clean, simple. It matched the story everybody already believed. The Sumerians thought civilization came from the gods, just like the Egyptians, the Greeks. Every ancient culture, case closed. But here's the deal. That tablet never stopped bothering him. Something was wrong. He couldn't name it, but for 40 years, it wouldn't let him go. Other scholars moved on. New discoveries, new publications, new awards. Kramer kept going back. Same tablet, same shelf, same lines he'd already published. And every single time, the words on the page didn't quite match the marks in the clay. So in 1988, at 91 years old, he went back down to that basement one final time. His assistant described what happened next. Kramer sat turning the clay over and over. He wasn't reading it. He was trying to unread it, trying to forget his own translation, trying to see what the original Sumerian actually said, not what he'd spent 4 decades assuming it must say. And then he stopped breathing. His hands froze. For 3 full minutes, he didn't move. His assistant stepped forward, asked if he needed a doctor. Kramer looked up. His voice was barely a whisper. "I've had it wrong, all of it, for 40 years. The word he'd translated as gift, it could also mean awakening or remembering. The word he'd translated as human, it could mean sleeping one or unaware one. The word he'd translated as God, it could mean fully conscious one or aware power. Now, pay attention, because this changes everything. With those alternative meanings, the tablet wasn't saying gods gave civilization to primitive humans. It was saying civilization emerged when humans woke up, when they accessed capacities they already possessed. What we call gods might have been the Sumerians' way of describing states of consciousness, modes of awareness we no longer access, not beings in the sky handing down knowledge. Something inside the human mind switching on. This wasn't a footnote correction. This turned the entire text inside out. And this wasn't some fringe theorist saying it. This was the guy, the only man alive whose translations define the field, saying with his final breath that the foundation was rotten. And what his own colleagues did next is even worse. The doubts he couldn't silence. To understand why this terrified the academic world, you need to understand one thing. Kramer didn't just study the Sumerians, he was the Sumerians. As far as the modern world was concerned, he built the house everybody lived in. Now he was saying the house had no foundation. When he started in the 1920s, Sumerian was completely dead. No instruction manual, no native speakers, no dictionaries, just thousands of clay fragments covered in wedge-shaped marks nobody could read. He taught himself. 6 decades, word by word, pattern by pattern, cross-referencing symbols with Akkadian translations, building an entire linguistic framework from scratch. Think about that for a second. 60 years alone in a basement, staring at marks pressed into clay by hands that turned to dust 3,000 years before Christ was born, teaching himself to hear what those hands were trying to say. His 1956 book, History Begins at Sumer, introduced millions to a civilization most Ais had never heard of. First love song ever recorded, first legal code, first school system, all Kramer. Every time archaeologists dug up tablets anywhere, Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Iran, they shipped them to him. One man, one interpretation, one lens through which all of ancient Sumer passed. And get this, he'd been doubting his own work for decades before that basement moment. Go back to his papers from the 1960s and 70s, not the conclusions, the footnotes. This word has no exact English equivalent. This concept is difficult to render in modern terms. Those footnotes got louder every decade, more troubled, more frequent. By the 1980s, he wrote something that should have set off alarms across the entire field. The more I study these texts, the less certain I become about their true meaning. His colleagues brushed it off. Sam's losing it, too long in that basement. But Kramer wasn't losing it. He'd found something that cracked everything wide open. The Sumerian language had no word for religion, none. No distinction between natural and supernatural. No concept of miracle because they had no concept of normal for a miracle to violate. They didn't separate sacred from secular. These categories we build our entire worldview on. They simply didn't exist for the Sumerians. Not because they were too primitive, because their experience of reality didn't require them. And that word we casually translate as God, it meant something closer to great power or cosmic principle. The Sumerians might not have thought of these as beings at all. Not in any sense we'd recognize. In a 1987 interview, Kramer leaned forward. The interviewer later said his eyes looked haunted. I am no longer convinced the Sumerians had anything like our concept of creation, or our concept of world. I think they were describing something completely different. His voice dropped. And I have spent 50 years putting their thoughts into categories they would not have recognized. 1 year later, the tablet broke him. And what happened after that took more courage than anything he'd done in 60 years of scholarship. The fallout. He showed his new translation to the people with the most to lose. Dr. William Hallow at Yale. 40 years of career built on Kramer's original translations. Books that cited Kramer on nearly every page. Doctoral students whose entire dissertations rested on Kramer's framework. Hallow read the reinterpretation. His face went white. His hand stopped mid-gesture over the paper. Sam, this would invalidate everything. My books, my students' dissertations, all of it. Dr. Miguel Civil at Chicago didn't even finish reading. He set the paper down, took off his glasses, rubbed his eyes. You need to rest, Sam. This isn't scholarship anymore. This is a breakdown. But Kramer couldn't stop. Once he saw it, he couldn't unsee it. He went back through every major translation, the creation myths, the flood narratives, the dialogues between kings and advisors, text after text after text, in every single one, the same fracture. He'd imposed modern categories onto Sumerian thought, decided what the text must mean based on what made sense to a 20th century mind. Words he'd translated as worship might have meant alignment. Divine commandment could have been inner knowing. Prayers to distant gods, maybe instructions for accessing states of mind. Here's the catch. He wasn't saying his translations were sloppy. He was saying the English language itself might not have the right containers for Sumerian thought. That modern consciousness and Sumerian consciousness might be so different that translating between them was like pouring water into a net. You go through the motions, you get nothing. The entire field had followed him into these assumptions. Thousands of scholars, decades of dissertations, all cracking from the inside out. If this is already making you rethink everything you learned in school, hit subscribe, because what comes next makes this look like a warm-up. What the Sumerians actually knew. Once Kramer looked with fresh eyes, the evidence hit him like a wall, and it wasn't subtle. Start with their math. We use base 10, 10 fingers, makes sense. The Sumerians use base 60. Sounds random? Sounds bizarre. Until you actually do the math. 60 is divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. It's one of the most mathematically elegant bases possible, far more versatile than our base 10. And here's the thing that nobody talks about. We still use it, every single day, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. 4,000 years later, their system is baked into how we measure time and space. Nobody has ever improved on it, not once in 4 millennia. The standard explanation? Clever mathematicians noticed useful properties. Kramer's question was different. What if base 60 wasn't a clever choice? What if it reflected how they actually perceived numerical relationships? A fundamentally different way of experiencing quantity, more natural to them than counting on fingers, not smarter, different. A different kind of mind. Think about that for a second. Now their astronomy. This is where it gets really strange. The Sumerians tracked planetary movements with precision that still startles scientists today. Star charts accurate for millennia. They knew the exact orbital periods of planets you cannot see without knowing precisely where and when to look. They cataloged celestial cycles with an accuracy Europeans didn't rediscover until the Renaissance, thousands of years later. And they did all of this without telescopes, without computers, without any instrument we consider essential. The textbook answer is patient observers, clear skies, lots of time. Kramer asked a harder question. What if they weren't just patiently observing? What if they were perceiving these patterns in a way we no longer can? What if the instruments weren't missing? What if the instrument was the mind itself? Then there was their technology. And this is where the mystery deepens. Irrigation systems of stunning sophistication that turn barren marshland into the most productive farmland on Earth. Ziggurats built with architectural precision, modern engineers still study and still can't fully explain. Advanced metallurgy that shouldn't have existed at that stage of human development. Cities housing tens of thousands of people with organized urban planning. Sewage systems, administrative bureaucracies. Agriculture complex enough to feed entire civilizations. And get this, it all appeared seemingly from nowhere, around 4,500 BCE. No slow buildup, no gradual progression from simple to complex, just suddenly civilization, fully formed, as if someone flipped a switch. The tablet said gods granted this knowledge to humanity. What if those weren't religious myths? What if they were describing sudden cognitive shifts? Moments when certain technologies became immediately obvious? Not gifts from the sky, awakenings from within. Now, here's where it gets dark. Kramer compared the earliest Sumerian tablets to the later ones, the ones written in the centuries before the civilization collapsed around 2000 BCE. The difference was staggering. The later texts weren't just different in content, they were different in kind, more concrete, more practical, flatter. The early tablets had a quality of thought that was layered and dense, almost musical. Ideas folding into ideas in ways that resisted simple translation. The later tablets read like instruction manuals, stripped of depth. The sophistication wasn't evolving, it was draining away, like watching a language forget its own words in real time. The later Sumerians were writing like people who no longer understood their own ancestors. They could copy the symbols, they could reproduce the shapes in the clay. But the deeper meaning behind those symbols had already been lost. They were echoing a language they could no longer actually speak. The famous King list showed the same pattern, and this might be the most disturbing piece of all. Early kings with impossibly long reigns, 28,800 years, 36,000 years, numbers that don't make any sense. Later, kings with normal lifespans, decades, not millennia. Every scholar on Earth reads that transition as mythology becoming history. The standard interpretation goes like this. Primitive people started with fantasy, made up big numbers because they didn't know better, then gradually got more realistic, grew up, learned to count properly. A civilization maturing out of its childhood myths. Kramer read it the opposite way, completely the opposite way. He saw a record of something being lost, not gained, lost. Whatever those early numbers represented, and it clearly wasn't literal years as we count them, the shift to normal lifespans marked a specific point, a point where something fundamental changed. Not just about how the Sumerians kept records, about how they experienced reality itself, about how they perceived time. The numbers didn't get more accurate over the centuries. The consciousness behind them got smaller, more limited, more narrow, more like ours. And here's what haunted Kramer most. Once that shift happened, it never reversed. Not once. The early way of seeing was gone permanently. The Sumerians who came after couldn't get it back. Even though the tablets describing it were sitting right in front of them, they could hold the words in their hands. They could read the symbols. But the meaning behind those symbols had become invisible to them, like a radio that could no longer pick up the frequency. In his final interview, weeks before death, Kramer's voice was barely audible. The camera had to zoom in just to capture the sound. I think Sumer's collapse wasn't a political event. It was a consciousness event. Something about how they experienced reality changed. And once it changed, they couldn't maintain their civilization. He leaned closer to the camera, eyes wet. We are their descendants, living in the aftermath of that change, trying to read their texts, but unable to understand them, because we're on the other side of the divide. What the academic world did with those words is the darkest part of this story. What they buried with him. Samuel Noah Kramer died on November 26, 1990, 93 years old. His obituary celebrated his translations, his honorary degrees, his decades of achievement. It praised his dedication to a field he'd essentially created single-handedly. It called him a pioneer, a legend, the father of Sumerian studies. It did not mention his late-life doubts. It did not discuss his final interviews. It did not acknowledge that the man who defined our understanding of Sumer spent his dying days insisting, begging, for people to hear that understanding was completely wrong. The academic establishment moved on, quietly, efficiently, deliberately. The way institutions always do when someone threatens the structure from the inside. His earlier translations stayed in the textbooks. His original interpretations kept shaping how Sumer was taught in every university on the planet. The narrative he built and then desperately tried to tear down in his final years remained fully intact, untouched, unchallenged, as if those last interviews never happened. As if a dying man's confession was just an old scholar losing his grip on reality. But here's the deal. Kramer's doubts didn't die with him. They couldn't. Because once you see the fracture, you can't unsee it. A small number of researchers noticed, quietly at first. Scholars in consciousness studies and cognitive anthropology started picking up where Kramer left off, asking the questions nobody in mainstream archaeology would touch. Questioning whether ancient civilizations didn't just know different things, but thought in fundamentally different ways, perceived reality through a completely different cognitive lens. Some began retranslating Sumerian texts with Kramer's late insights in mind, not his 1950s translations, his 1988 translations, the ones that never made it into the textbooks. The results are startling. Texts that looked like religious myths start reading as descriptions of consciousness states. King lists become records of different modes of existence. Not mythology growing into history, but one kind of awareness fading into another. Creation stories become accounts of cognitive awakening, not divine intervention. Hymns that seem like worship start sounding like techniques, specific instructions for shifting perception, for accessing something the Sumerians considered completely natural, something built into the human mind that we've long since forgotten how to reach. None of this has reached mainstream academia, not yet. Too many careers at stake, too many reputations built on the old framework, too many textbooks that would need rewriting from page one, too many tenured professors who'd have to stand in front of their students and admit they spent their entire lives teaching something that might not be true. But the deeper resistance is this. And this is what keeps me up at night. If Kramer was right, our entire story about human progress falls apart. Every assumption we hold about moving forward as a species. We think we're the pinnacle, the most advanced humans who ever lived, the the ones who finally figured it out. But what if the Sumerians weren't primitive? What if they had capacities we can't even name anymore? What if what we call progress actually means gaining certain abilities while quietly losing others? Others we don't even know are missing because we lost the ability to notice their absence. The tablets are still there, thousands of them, sitting in museums, in archives, in university basements not so different from the one where Kramer spent his life. Covered in cuneiform, we can technically read. But if he was right, we're reading words while missing meanings, translating language while failing to translate the consciousness that created it, staring at the surface of something whose depth we can no longer perceive, holding the answers in our hands and not knowing it. His last words on camera, the ones they tried to bury. Before I die, please listen. We have gotten this wrong, not the details, the whole framework. And until we admit that our modern consciousness might not be capable of understanding ancient consciousness, we will keep teaching a history that never happened and missing a truth we desperately need to recover. So, here's my question. Do you think we've lost something our ancestors had? Or was Kramer simply wrong? Drop your theory in the comments. And if you want more forbidden history the academic establishment doesn't want you to see, smash that like button and subscribe. See you in the next one.